The sound of the slap cut clean through the music, and the Duke of Danecar, standing unseen in the shadow of the ballroom doorway, went very still. He had come late and by the side door, as was his habit, because he despised these crushes and attended them only when he must. And he had paused there in the dark of the anteroom to find her in the crowd before he went in, the way he always found her first, the small brown-haired figure that half the room looked through and he could have picked out blindfold. He had found her. She was near the great windows, cornered, and a man was leaning over her. Sir Halbert Vane, the Duke saw with a cold clarity, the very man, and the man's voice had risen, and the woman had said something the Duke could not hear, something quiet and level and unafraid. And Sir Halbert Vane had drawn back his hand and struck her across the face in front of 200 people. The music faltered. A gasp went up. Then that terrible avid silence of a crowd that has smelled scandal and drawn in its breath to feast. Berengaria did not cry out. That was the thing the Duke of Danecar would remember all his life, the thing that undid him even as the fury rose in him like a black tide, that his wife, struck across the face before the whole of society, did not cry out, did not stagger, did not weep. She put one hand to the mark blooming red on her cheek, and she lifted her chin, and she looked Sir Halbert Vane full in the eyes with a composure so complete that it was, in its way, more terrible than any scream, and she said, in a voice that carried in the silence, "You have not changed at all. Halbert, I once thought your cruelty was the worst thing about you. I see now it was only the most honest. You insolent little nobody." Sir Halbert spat, and his hand rose again. It did not fall, for the Duke of Danecar crossed the ballroom. He did not remember crossing it. He would try afterward to reconstruct how he had come from the shadow of the doorway to the center of the floor, and he never could. There was the slap, and the black tide, and then he was there, and his hand had closed around Sir Halbert Vane's raised wrist like a manacle of iron. And the whole room was staring, and the music had stopped entirely now, and into the ringing silence the Duke of Danecar said, in the low, deadly voice that had made stronger men than Halbert Vane go pale, "If you raise your hand to my wife again, Vane, I will break it. And then I will break the other, and then we will discuss at length, and in a quieter room, exactly what is owed for the mark you have already put on her face." The silence that followed was the loudest thing the Duke had ever heard. He watched it go across Sir Halbert Vane's face, the word wife landing and not landing, and then landing all at once with the force of a collapsing building. He watched the color drain out of the man. He watched the whole ballroom, 200 faces, perform the same arithmetic in the same instant, that the small brown-haired nobody in the corner, the poor relation, the jilted woman everyone had learned to look through, the companion no one troubled to name was the Duchess of Danecar, that the most feared and most private man in England, who had not been seen to court any woman, who was rumoured to despise the whole institution of marriage, who could have had any heiress in 3 kingdoms, had married her. And that Sir Halbert Vane had just struck the wife of the Duke of Danecar across the face in front of the entire assembled beau monde, and that whatever became of Sir Halbert Vane now, it would not be pleasant, and it would be public, and he had done it entirely to himself. "Your," Sir Halbert's voice cracked, "your wife. Danecar, there is some mistake. She is Miss Kemberley. She is a companion, a poor relation of the Ashworths. She cannot possibly be." "She is Berengaria, Duchess of Danecar," the Duke said, and he did not raise his voice, and every soul in the room heard every word. "We were married in the spring, quietly at my estate, for reasons that are my own and no concern of yours or of anyone in this room. She has been living as Miss Kemberley, in the household of relations who did not want her and did not trouble to be kind to her, because she chose to remain there a little longer to settle certain affairs and to spare a young cousin she loves the loss of her company. And because she is the sort of woman who thinks first of others and last of her own comfort, which is a quality, Vane, that you would not recognize if it were explained to you with diagrams." His grip tightened. The Duke saw Sir Halbert wince. "You knew her once. You were engaged to her 5 years ago, before her father died and the money failed. And when the money failed, you threw her over within the week, publicly, cruelly, for an heiress with a squint and £40,000, and you let it be understood that the fault was hers. And you have spent 5 years since then treating her, whenever you have chanced to meet her, with the particular contempt of a man who needs the person he wronged to be worthless, so that his wronging of them need not trouble his sleep. I know all of this. I know it because she told me not as a complaint. She does not complain. She told me because I asked, and because she does not lie. And I have waited vain, I will confess it. I have waited some while for the pleasure of this exact moment, and you have exceeded even my hopes. For I had thought you would merely insult her, and instead, before the whole of society, you have struck her, and given me leave to do to your reputation, tonight, in this room, precisely what you did to hers 5 years ago, only where you had a lie to work with. I have the truth, and the truth. Vain does so much more lasting a damage. Berengaria had come to stand beside him. The Duke felt her there without turning. He always felt her there, and he heard her say quietly, for his ear alone, Joris, do not break his hand. He is not worth the trouble it would make you. And then, more quietly still, though I confess I am glad, God forgive me, that you wanted to. The Duke of Danecar released Sir Halbert Vane's wrist, and the man staggered back, cradling it, his face the colour of ash. And the Duke turned his back on him, the cut direct, the cruelest thing one gentleman can do to another, performed by a Duke before 200 witnesses, and gave his arm to his wife, and looked at last, fully, at the red mark on her face. And something moved behind his eyes that the whole watching room saw, and that Sir Halbert Vane saw, and that Berengaria alone understood, because she alone knew what it had cost this particular man to let himself love anyone at all. Come, the Duke said gently to his wife, in a voice that had lost all its deadliness and held only tenderness now, come away. You have done nothing wrong, and you have borne it with more grace than every soul in this room deserves to witness, and I find I do not want to share you with them one moment longer. Come home, Berengaria. Come home, and let me see to your face, and let the whole of London spend the night discovering that the nobody in the corner was the Duchess of Danecar all along, and that the man who struck her is finished. It is no more than the truth, and the truth tonight is entirely on our side. He led her out through the parting, staring, whispering crowd, and he did not hurry, and he did not look at any of them, and Berengaria walked beside him with her chin high and the mark red on her cheek, and the Duke of Danecar thought that he had never in his life been so angry, or so proud, or so completely, dangerously, irrevocably in love. He had first seen her a year before, and he had not that first time seen her at all. That was the shaming truth of it, and the Duke of Danecar was honest enough with himself to own it. He had been a guest at Ashworth Park. One of those interminable country visits he endured for the sake of business. Old Ashworth held mortgages the Duke wished to buy up, to relieve certain tenants. Ashworth was squeezing, and Berengaria had been there the whole while, the poor relation, the companion to Ashworth's sour wife. The small brown figure who fetched shawls and read aloud and made herself useful and invisible, and the Duke of Danecar, who prided himself on missing nothing, had missed her entirely. She was precisely invisible. She had made herself so. It was the survival of a woman with no money and no protector, living on the sufferance of relations who resented her, to be useful and silent and small, to give no one any reason to notice her, because to be noticed in such a house was only ever to be found fault with. He had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time on the third night, in the library at 2 in the morning, when neither of them had known the other was there. The Duke did not sleep well, he never had, and he had come down to the library for a book, and found the fire still faintly warm and a single candle burning, and Berengaria Kemberley asleep in a chair with a book fallen open in her lap. He had stopped in the doorway. He had meant to withdraw. And then he had seen what the book was. It was a volume of his own, or rather of the great library's, a difficult work of natural philosophy in Latin that he had been reading himself, and had wondered at finding shelved in a house like Ashworth's where no one read anything, and he had seen, tucked into it, a sheet of paper covered in a small clear hand, and being a man of few scruples where his curiosity was concerned, he had looked at it. It was a translation. She had been translating the Latin, for no reason, for no master, for no purpose but her own pleasure, at 2 in the morning, in stolen candlelight, after a full day of fetching Miss Ashworth's shawls, and the translation was good. It was better than good. It was more graceful and more exact than his own reading of the same passage, and it was annotated in the margins with observations of a quickness and originality, that stopped the Duke of Danecar where he stood. Because he had spent his whole life among the most educated men in England, and had rarely met a mind that moved like the one on that page. He had stood in the library doorway and looked from the sleeping woman to the page and back, and he had felt the ground shift very slightly under him, as it does when a man discovers that the world contains something he had not known was in it. He had put another log on the fire quietly, so she would not be cold, and he had withdrawn and taken nothing and said nothing. But after that he saw her. He could not stop seeing her. Once a man has truly seen a person, he cannot go back to looking through them, and the Duke of Danecar spent the rest of that visit in the strange position of being the only person in the house who knew that the invisible companion was the most interesting person in it. He watched her fetch the shawls. He watched her endure Mrs. Ashworth's small cruelties with a composure he came to understand was not meekness at all, but a kind of steel, the deliberate refusal of a strong person to give a weak one the satisfaction of a reaction. He watched her be kind to the one creature in that house who loved her, young Cassandra Ashworth, a plain shy girl of 15 whom her own parents neglected and Berengaria mothered, and he watched no one but himself, notice that there was a remarkable woman in their midst. He engineered conversations. This was not easy. A duke cannot simply strike up talk with a companion without causing comment, and Berengaria, when he tried, deflected him with a worriness that he came only slowly to understand. She thought he was toying with her. Of course she thought so. A great man's sudden interest in a poor woman meant, in her experience, exactly one thing, and it was not honorable, and she had learned to close herself against it like a house shutting its windows before a storm. It took him 3 days to make her understand that he wished to speak with her about the natural philosophy and nothing else, that he had read her translation and thought it brilliant and wanted to argue a point of it, and when she finally understood that he was in earnest, that a duke wished to debate Latin with her at 11 in the morning in the cold garden where no one would see them talking, something in her wary face had opened, just slightly, just for a moment. And the Duke of Danecar had felt that small opening as though a door had been flung wide in his own chest. They argued the philosophy. She won. She won handily, and she did not spare him, and when he pressed a point she thought weak, she demolished it with a precision that would have been rude in a drawing room, and was, in the cold garden, purely exhilarating. The Duke of Danecar had spent 38 years being deferred to, flattered, feared, managed. He had forgotten, if he had ever known, the sheer pleasure of being met, of speaking to someone who did not care in the least that he was a duke, who cared only whether he was right, and told him plainly when he was not. He went back to Danecar at the end of that visit with old Ashworth's mortgages in his pocket and Berengaria Kembley's face in his mind, and he found over the weeks that followed that he could not get her out of it, and that he did not, when he examined the matter honestly, wish to. He learned her history slowly, and it made him angrier the more he learned. She had been the only child of a gentleman of small fortune, well educated by a father who loved her and treated her mind as worth cultivating, which was itself rare enough. At 19 she had been engaged, respectably and with affection, to Sir Hulbert Vane, a match everyone approved, and then her father had died, and the small fortune had proved smaller than anyone knew, mortgaged to the roof. And within the week of the discovery Sir Hulbert Vane had thrown her over, not privately, not kindly, but with a public brutality calculated to shift the blame onto her, so that no breath of fickleness should attach to him. He had let it be understood that he had discovered something to her discredit. He had never said what. He had not needed to. The mere suggestion, from a man against a woman with no father and no fortune to defend her, had been enough. She had gone from an engaged gentleman's daughter to a ruined nobody in the space of a fortnight, and the only roof that had opened to her had been the Ashworths, who took her because a poor relation is cheaper than a paid companion, and let her know it every day for 5 years. 5 years. The Duke of Danecar thought about those 5 years a great deal. 5 years of a mind like that fetching shawls. 5 years of that steel and that grace and that quickness spent on enduring the small cruelties of small people, unseen, unthanked, translating Latin at 2 in the morning for the only pleasure left to her, because a man had wanted her worthless and society had been happy to oblige him. It was The Duke thought one of the quietest crimes he had ever encountered, and one of the worst, precisely because it was so quiet. No blood, no theft, nothing anyone could be hanged for, only the slow, patient murder of a remarkable life by neglect and contempt, and the whole world's cheerful complicity in it. He resolved to end it. He did not, at first, entirely admit to himself what form the ending would take. He told himself he wished to help her settle a small independence on her, perhaps anonymously enough to free her from the Ashworths. He was rich enough that it would cost him nothing, and it would be a kind of justice. He told himself this for several weeks, and then, one night at Danecar, alone in his own great library with her remembered face, and her remembered voice and the memory of being, for the first time in his life, truly met, the Duke of Danecar set down his glass and admitted the truth to himself, which was that he did not want to settle an independence on Berengaria Kembley and free her to live her own life somewhere far away from him. He wanted to marry her, he who had held the whole institution in contempt, who had fended off every matchmaking mother in England for 20 years, who had believed himself constitutionally incapable of the thing he wanted, to marry the invisible companion who had beaten him at Latin in a cold garden. And he wanted it with an intensity that frightened him, and he was not, he discovered, going to be able to talk himself out of it. Making her believe him was the hardest thing he had ever done. He went back to Ashworth Park in the autumn on a pretext, and he found a way to speak to her alone. It was easier this time. He had learned the geography of the house and the hours when the family did not want her, and he told her, plainly without ornament, that he wished to marry her. She laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, and it was not a happy one. It was the laugh of a woman who has been hurt so thoroughly that a good thing offered can only be a trap, and who defends herself with disbelief, because disbelief is the only shield she has left. "Your Grace," she said, "I do not know what game this is, and I will not pretend I am not wounded to find you playing it, because I had come foolishly to think you a man of a different sort. But I am not a fool, whatever these last 5 years have taught the world to think of me. Dukes do not marry penniless companions with ruined names. If you want a mistress, you have mistaken me, and mistaken me insultingly. If you want sport, you have chosen a poor subject. I have had 5 years' practice at being the object of powerful people's amusement, and I no longer find it wounds me as it did. Either way, I would be obliged if you would let me go. Mrs. Ashworth will want her shawl." Berengaria. He said it was the first time he had used her name, and he saw it startle her. "Look at me and tell me what you see, not what your 5 years have taught you to expect. What you actually see in front of you now." She looked at him. He held still under it and let her look, and he watched her wariness war with the evidence of her own eyes. For whatever else Berengaria Kembley was, she was too honest a thinker to ignore evidence, even when the evidence frightened her. "I see a man who is not laughing," she said slowly. "Who is not looking at me the way men look at sport. Who looks," she stopped, "who looks almost as frightened as I am, which makes no sense at all, because you are the Duke of Danecar, and you have nothing in the world to be frightened of." "I have exactly one thing in the world to be frightened of," said the Duke, "and I am looking at it, and it is not going well, because it is looking back at me as though I mean it harm, when the truth is I have never in my life meant anyone less harm or more good. I am frightened, Berengaria, because I have spent 38 years perfectly certain that I would never do this, never want this, never be fool enough to hand any woman the power to wound me. And then I read a translation of Lucretius at 2 in the morning and argued philosophy in a cold garden with a woman who did not care that I was a duke and cared very much that I was wrong. And I discovered that all my certainty was the certainty of a man who had simply never met the person who would undo it. I have met her now. She is standing in front of me telling me to fetch a shawl, and I am asking her to marry me, not for sport, not for a season, not as any kind of arrangement, but for the whole of both our lives, because I have looked at the alternative, a life in which I go back to Danecar and you stay here fetching shawls and we never argue Lucretius again, and I find I cannot bear it. That is the whole of it. That is the truth. I know you have no reason on earth to believe a word of it. I am asking you to believe it anyway, or at least to let me spend as long as it takes to prove it. It took him until the winter to prove it. She would not be rushed, and he did not rush her, though it cost him more patience than he had known he possessed. He wrote to her letters that came, by an arrangement they contrived, to the one servant at Ashworth Park who could be trusted. An old gardener Berengaria had been kind to for years, and the letters were not love letters, or not only. They were the continuation of the argument in the garden, page after page of philosophy and books and ideas, the correspondence of two minds that had found each other. And it was through the letters, more than through any protestation, that Berengaria came at last to believe him. For a man may lie in a proposal, she told him afterward. A man may even lie in a love letter, if he is practiced enough. But no man writes 12 pages arguing the finer points of natural philosophy with a woman he means only to seduce or to mock. The letters were the proof. They were the thing that could not be counterfeited, the plain evidence week after week, that the Duke of Danecar valued her mind, sought it out, delighted in it, treated it as the equal of his own, which no one, not even her father, had ever entirely done, and which was, she confessed, the one form of courtship against which she had no defense at all, because it was the one thing she had wanted her whole life and given up hoping for. They were married in the spring at Danecar, very quietly. The quietness was her idea before it was his, and the Duke came to see the wisdom of it, though it went against his every instinct. For his instinct was to marry her before the whole of England and dare anyone to say a word. Berengaria had thought it through, as she thought everything through, and she laid it out for him plainly. "If you marry me before all the world," she said, "in a great public wedding, with the trumpets out, then the story becomes at once the story of the Duke's astonishing folly, the great man who threw himself away on a ruined nobody, and it will be told and retold, and I will spend the rest of my life as a curiosity, the companion who trapped a duke. And every kindness you show me will be read as proof of my cunning, and every fault of mine will be magnified into evidence that you were deceived. Whereas if we marry quietly, and I remain a while longer as I am, and society is left in ignorance, then when the truth comes out, as truth does, it will come out on our terms, at a moment of our choosing, in a shape that we control. Let them discover it. Let them find out all at once that the nobody they looked through was a duchess all along. There is a great deal of power, Joris, in being underestimated. My 5 years have taught me that. Let us use it." He had married her on those terms, and he had come, over the months that followed, to understand the full shrewdness of them, and to understand, too, the other reason she had given for remaining at Ashworth Park a little longer as plain Miss Kemberley, a reason that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the kind of woman he had married. "Cassandra," she had said, "I cannot simply vanish and leave her. She is 15, and she is plain, and she is shy, and her own mother despises her for all three, and I am the only creature in that house who has ever told her she is worth anything. If I disappear overnight into a duchess's life, she will believe I abandoned her the moment something better offered, that I was only ever biding my time, like everyone else in her life, and it will confirm the worst thing she believes about herself, which is that no one stays. I will not do that to her. Let me remain a few months more. Let me prepare her. Let me arrange matters so that when the truth comes out, she comes with me, for I mean to take her, Joris. I mean for us to take that neglected child into our own house and give her the growing up she has been denied. If you will have her and let her understand that I did not leave her but sent for her, that is my condition, and it is the only one I have, and it is not negotiable. It is not a condition, the Duke of Danecar had said, and he had meant it with his whole heart. It is the finest thing I have ever heard anyone say, and it is the exact reason I am marrying you, and of course we will take the child. Danecar is large and empty, and I have wanted for years to fill it with something that mattered. Bring your Cassandra, bringing a one you love. I have spent my life keeping people out. I find I would like, for once, to let someone in." It was Berengaria who drew out of him, at last, the history of why he had built the fortress, for she had wondered at it from the beginning. This coldness in a man who was underneath, so plainly capable of warmth, and she was not a woman to leave a question unexamined. She asked him one night in the chapel, in the early days, gently, whether he had always been so guarded, or whether something had made him so. And the Duke of Danecar, who had never spoken of it to a living soul, found that he could speak of it to her, because she was the one person in the world he was certain would not use it against him. "My father," he said, married my mother for her fortune and her bloodline, and he made no secret of it, to her or to anyone, his whole life. It was, he thought, the correct way to marry, the only way a man of sense married. Affection was for fools and for the lower orders. A great alliance was a matter of property and lineage and nothing else. And my mother, who had married him hoping for something more, learned within a year that there was nothing more to be had, and he paused. She did not fade exactly. She was too proud to fade. She hardened instead. She matched his coldness with her own. And the two of them lived out 40 years in a great house in a state perfect frozen civility, never a cross word and never a warm one. Two people who shared a name and a table and a bed and were, to the end, strangers, and I grew up between them watching it. The only child of a marriage with no love in it, and I drew from it the lesson that any observant child would draw, which was that this was what marriage was, what love was, what the whole business between men and women was, a cold transaction dressed up in civility, a thing to be managed and never felt, and that a man who let himself feel anything for a wife was a fool who had failed to learn the rules. Berengaria said nothing, only held his hand in the dark of the ruined chapel, and let him go on. And then, the Duke said, when I was young 22 I fell in love, truly, entirely, the way one does at 22. She was beautiful, and she seemed to love me, and I thought I had discovered that my parents were wrong, that love was real after all, that I would have the warm, true marriage they had denied themselves. I was a fool. She loved the dukedom. I found it out by accident, overheard her, at a ball, telling a friend how tedious she found me, how she counted the cost of enduring me against the prize of being a duchess, how she meant to be a very fashionable duchess indeed, and see as little of her dull husband as the thing could be managed. I was standing behind a pillar. She did not know I heard. I never told her I had. I simply ended it, coldly, gave her no reason, let her think me capricious, and let her hate me, which was easier to bear than the truth. He drew a breath. And that was the night, Berengaria, that I built the fortress. 22 years old, behind a pillar at a ball, hearing the woman I loved describe me as a tedious means to a title. I decided that night that my parents had been right after all, that love was a fiction the beautiful used to trap the rich, that I had been a fool to believe in it, and that I would never be a fool again, and I kept that vow for 16 years. I made myself into exactly what my father had been, only more so, colder, more feared, more untouchable, a man with a fortress where his heart should be, and I told myself it was wisdom, and it was only fear, the fear of a boy behind a pillar who had been shown that the thing he most wanted was a lie. And then Berengaria said softly, "You read a translation of Lucretius at 2 in the morning." And then I read a translation of Lucretius at 2 in the morning. The Duke agreed, written by a woman who did not know I existed, for no reward, for no eyes but her own. Out of the pure disinterested love of a beautiful idea, and something in me that had been frozen for 16 years cracked, just slightly, because here at last was the proof against everything I'd built my fortress on. Here was a person who valued a thing for itself, with nothing to gain, no title to trap, no fortune to catch. If such a person existed, and she plainly did, the evidence was in my hand, then my whole cold philosophy was wrong, and love was not always a transaction, and worth was not always a mask over greed, and the fortress I had spent 16 years building had been founded on a single overheard sentence and might, therefore, be founded on a mistake. That is what your translation did to me, Berengaria, before I ever met you. It was the first evidence in 16 years that the world might be warmer than I had decided it was, and I could not stop turning it over, and I had to come back and find you, because you had, without knowing it, without ever meeting me. The first crack in a wall it had taken me half my life to build. Berengaria was quiet a long moment. Then she said, "So we are both of us people who were taught, young and cruelly, that we were worth nothing but what we could be used for. I was taught it by Halbert Vane, who threw me away when my fortune failed and told the world it was my fault. You were taught it by a woman behind a pillar who wanted your title and found you tedious. And we each built our defenses. I made myself small and invisible to give no one a target. You made yourself cold and enormous to give no one a way in. Different fortresses, the same fear, the same wound underneath, The fear that we were not in ourselves, worth loving, that we were only ever wanted for what we had, and would be discarded the moment we ceased to have it. She turned to him in the dark. Do you see what we are to each other, then? We are the disproof. You are the proof to me that a person can be loved for themselves and not for their fortune, because you loved me when I had nothing, when I was a nobody in a corner, when loving me could gain you not one thing in all the world and cost you the good opinion of your entire class. And I am the proof to you that a person can love you and not your dukedom, because I fell in love with you over Lucretius, arguing philosophy in a cold garden, caring nothing that you were a duke and everything for whether you were right. We are each the answer to the other's oldest fear. That is not a small thing, Joris. That is the whole thing. That is what a true marriage is. I think not that two people are happy together, though we are, but that each is, to the other, the living proof against the lie they were told about themselves when they were too young to defend against it. You are my proof. I am yours. And we shall spend the rest of our lives being it for each other, and slowly, year by year, the fortresses will come down, because a wall built out of fear cannot stand very long against a person who is, every single day, the evidence that the fear was wrong. The Duke of Danecar held his wife in the ruined chapel and understood that she had just explained to him, in the space of a few minutes, the thing he had failed to understand about his own heart for 38 years, and he thought that this was what it was, to be truly known. To have another person see all the way to the bottom of you, to the boy behind the pillar and the frozen house and the whole architecture of your fear, and to love you not in spite of it but through it, and to hand you back your own history remade into something you could finally bear to look at. He had spent 16 years believing himself unlovable and calling it wisdom. It had taken a woman translating Lucretius at 2 a.m. to prove him wrong, and she was going on proving him wrong every day, and would go on proving it, he understood, for the rest of both their lives, until the fort was gone entirely, and there was nothing left where it had stood but a warm and crowded house, and a man who had learned at last, and only just in time, that he had been worth loving all along. The months of the secret marriage were the strangest of the Duke of Danecar's life, and though he would not have traded them, the hardest. For a season and more he was a married man whose wife lived 30 miles away in another man's house, fetching another woman's shawls, addressed by the world as Miss Kembley and by her employers as an expense. It went against everything in him. Every instinct of the Duke of Danecar, the possessiveness, the pride, the plain protective fury, rebelled against leaving his wife one more day in the household of people who used her ill. But Berengaria had asked it. For Cassandra's sake and for the sake of the strategy she had thought through so carefully, and the Duke had learned, already, that his wife's judgment was sounder than his instinct, and so he mastered the instinct, and he waited. And he found the waiting a discipline that taught him things about himself he had never had cause to learn. They contrived to meet. It was not easy, and the difficulty of it, the secrecy, the snatched hours, the elaborate innocent pretext lent those meetings a quality the Duke never forgot. The heightened, breathless preciousness of a thing that must be stolen. He would ride out ostensibly to inspect a distant property, and she would walk out ostensibly to visit the old gardener's cottage or to gather simples for Mrs. Ashworth's still-room, and they would meet in a ruined chapel on the edge of the Ashworth land, a roofless old place among trees where no one came, and there, for an hour, twice a month. The Duke and Duchess of Danecar were husband and wife in fact as well as in law. He remembered those chapel hours all his life. He remembered her coming through the trees in her plain gown with her basket of herbs, the poor companion, and the way her whole bearing changed the moment she saw him, the wariness and the smallness that she wore like armour at Ashworth Park falling away, so that by the time she reached him she was herself again, upright and quick and unafraid, the woman of the cold garden, the woman only he knew. He remembered arguing philosophy among the ruins with the wind in the ivy. He remembered, most of all, the ache of watching her go again at the end of each stolen hour, watching her put the armour back on before she walked out of the trees. Watching his wife make herself small again to survive a house she should never have had to survive, and the fury it raised in him, and the vow it hardened in him, that this would not last, that he would have her out of there and into a rightful place, if it took the moving of heaven and earth. I do not know how you bear it, he said to her once, in the chapel, holding her before she went. To be yourself here with me for 1 hour, and then to walk back into that house and be nobody again. It would drive me mad. It is driving me mad, and I only watch it. How do you bear it? I bear it, Berengaria said, because it is nearly over, and because there is a reason for it, and because I have borne far worse for no reason at all for 5 years. It is a strange thing, Joris, it was harder to be nobody at Ashworth Park before I knew you than it is now. Before, the smallness was the whole of my life. There was nothing else. I was Miss Kembley all the way down, and it was slowly killing me. Now the smallness is only a costume I put on for a few weeks more, and underneath it I am the Duchess of Dankar, and I am loved, and I have a chapel in the woods where I am myself twice a month, and I have Cassandra to see safely out, and it is all nearly over. The costume does not touch me anymore. That is the thing you gave me, before you ever gave me a name or a house. You gave me back myself in the cold garden, and once a person has been truly seen, the not being seen can never again be quite as deadly as it was, because they carry the seeing inside them. I put on Miss Kembley in the mornings the way an actor puts on a part, but I take her off in this chapel, and I will take her off for good very soon, and I am not afraid of her any more, because I know now that she was never really me. You taught me that. It is why I can bear the last of it. Be patient a little longer, my love. The costume comes off soon, and then I shall never wear it again. It was in those last weeks of the secret marriage that Sir Halbert Vane came back into her orbit, for Vane, whose fortunes had already begun their long decline, had taken to haunting the country houses of the neighbourhood in search of a rich second wife, and he turned up at last at Ashworth Park, where he found, to his found's sour amusement, the woman he had jilted 5 years before, still installed as a poor companion, still nobody, still, as he supposed, entirely beneath the notice of a man like himself, and he could not resist her. That was the thing the Duke understood afterward, piecing it together, that a certain kind of man cannot leave alone the person he has wronged, because their continued lowness is the proof he needs that his wrong was justified, and their smallest sign of spirit is an unbearable reproach that must be crushed. Vane baited her. He condescended to her, mocked her, reminded her before others of her fallen state, all with the lazy cruelty of a man perfectly secure in his own superiority, not knowing, could not have dreamed, that the companion he tormented went twice a month to a ruined chapel to be the Duchess of Dankar, and that her patience under his cruelty was not the meekness of the beaten, but the composure of a woman who knew exactly what was coming and had only to wait for it. She told the Duke of it in the chapel calmly, and the Duke's fury had risen so hot that he had been all for ending the secrecy that very week, riding to Ashworth Park and taking her out and calling Vane to account on the spot. But Berengaria had stayed his hand. No, she had said. Not yet, and not privately. Listen to me, Joris. If you take me out now in anger over Halbert Vane, then Vane becomes the reason the whole thing becomes about him, and I will not give him even that much importance. And a private accounting settles nothing. He will tell it his own way and be pitied. Let it wait. Let it wait for the right moment, the public moment, the moment of our choosing. Cassandra is nearly settled. Society does not yet know. Let us keep it so a little longer, and let Vane go on tormenting the nobody he thinks I am, and let him do it in public, before witnesses, at some great gathering, and then let the truth come down on him all at once, in front of everyone, at the worst possible moment for him and the best for us. He is building his own scaffold, Joris, one cruelty at a time. Do not interrupt him. Let him finish it. And then we will spring the trap, and it will be 100 times more terrible than anything you could do to him in a chapel in your anger. The Duke of Dankar had looked at his wife with something close to awe. You are planning it, he said. You are actually planning the whole thing, the public revelation, the moment. You are laying a trap for Halbert Vane and using yourself as the bait, and you are perfectly calm about it. I have had 5 years, Berengaria had said, to think about what I would do to Halbert Vane if I ever had the power. I told you that. I have the plan ready. I have always had the plan ready. All I lacked was the power, and now, thanks to you, I have that too. So yes, Joris, I am planning it. And when it comes, and it will come at a ball, I should think, for that is where such men do their cruelest work, you must be ready to play your part. which is to cross the room when I need you and say the true things in that terrible quiet voice of yours, and not one moment before. Can you do that? Can you wait for my signal and not spend yourself early in anger? It is the hardest thing I will ever ask of you, but it is the difference between wounding him and destroying him, and I mean to destroy him cleanly in the daylight, with the truth. Will you wait? I will wait, the Duke of Danecar had said, though it costs me everything I have. You are the most formidable person I have ever known, Berengaria, and I include myself in the reckoning, and I thank God I am on your side of this, because I should not at all like to be on the other. And he had waited all those weeks, holding his fury on its chain, until the night at the ball when Sir Halbert Vane, secure in his contempt, raised his hand to a nobody in a corner, and the trap that Berengaria had laid so patiently sprang shut. Exactly as she had planned it, and the Duke of Danecar crossed the room. In the carriage, going home through the dark London streets, the Duke of Danecar held his wife's hand and looked at the mark on her face and found that his fury, which he had mastered in the ballroom, wanted very badly to come back. I should have broken his hand, he said low. You told me not to, and I did not, and I obeyed you because you asked it. But I want you to know that every mile of this drive I am regretting the obedience. He struck you. He struck you across the face in front of 200 people. There is a part of me, Berengaria, that would happily turn this carriage around. I know, she said. She had not let go of his hand. And I love you for the part of you that wants to. But I am glad you did not, and I will tell you why, and it is not softness, you know. I am not soft about Halbert Vane. It is that a broken hand heals and is forgotten, and would make him, in the eyes of the world, a victim, the man the brutal Duke of Danecar assaulted at a ball. Whereas what you actually did to him tonight will never heal and will never be forgotten. You turned your back on him. Before all of society, you gave him the cut direct, and you told the whole room in that terrible quiet voice exactly what he did to me 5 years ago, the truth, which he has spent 5 years burying under a lie. You did not injure his hand. You injured his name, which is the only thing he has ever cared about, and you did it with the truth, which means it cannot be answered or undone or revenged. By morning there will not be a drawing room in London that will receive him. You have finished him, Joris. Completely and permanently, and without breaking a single bone. It is a far more terrible thing than violence, and it is the thing he deserves, and you did it in perfect control, which is the only revenge worth taking, the kind you will never have cause to regret. The Duke was silent a moment. You are frighteningly good at this, he said. I have had 5 years to think about what I would do to Halbert Vane if I ever had the power, said Berengaria, and for the first time that night something flickered in her composure, something that was not quite a smile and not quite tears. I did not expect the power to arrive in the shape of a husband who crosses a ballroom like the wrath of God, but I had the plan ready, you see. I always had the plan ready. A woman with no power spends a great deal of time perfecting the revenge she will never be able to take. And then tonight, quite suddenly, I could take, or rather you could, on my behalf, and I found that I did not want the loud version after all. I wanted the quiet, permanent, truthful one. I think that is a kind of growing, Joris. 5 years ago I would have wanted him to bleed. Tonight I only wanted him finished and myself free of him, and I have both, and I find I feel nothing for him at all now, not even hatred, which is the surest sign that he no longer has any power over me. That is your gift to me tonight, not the revenge, the freedom from needing it. When they reached Danecar House, the Duke took her up himself and sat her by the fire and sent for cloths and cool water, and he would let no maid do it. He tended the mark on her face with his own hands. This great feared man kneeling by his wife's chair and bathing her cheek with a gentleness that would have astonished every soul in the ballroom, and Berengaria watched him do it with an expression he could not quite read. What is it? He asked. You are looking at me strangely. I am thinking, she said, that no one has taken care of me since my father died. 5 years. In 5 years no one has. Once when I was ill at Ashworth Park I nursed myself. When I was tired no one noticed. When I was hurt I hid it, because to be hurt in that house was to be a nuisance. I had forgotten what it was to be taken care of. I had trained myself to forget it, because the wanting of it was too painful when there was no chance of it. And now here is the Duke of Danecar on his knees bathing my face, and I find I do not know how to bear it, Joris. Kindness. I could bear the cruelty. I got very good at bearing the cruelty. It is the kindness I have no defences for. It undoes me completely. The Duke of Dankar set down the cloth, and he took his wife's face very carefully in his hands, mindful of the mark, and he said, "Then let it undo you. You have spent 5 years armoured against cruelty, and it kept you alive, and I honour it, and I will never ask you to lower that armour toward the people who would hurt you. But you may lower it toward me. That is what this is, Berengaria. That is what marriage is meant to be, though God knows I did not understand it until I met you. It is the one place in all the world where you may be undone, where you need no armour, where being hurt is not a nuisance and being tired is noticed, and being ill means someone nurses you. You are safe here. You will always be safe here. You may fall apart in this house as often as you please, and I will be here every time to gather up the pieces, because that is not a burden to me, do you understand? It is the entire point. It is the thing I have been missing my whole life without knowing what it was. Someone to take care of. Someone who let me take care of you. It is all I want. It is all I have ever wanted, and I did not know it until you. And Berengaria Kembley, Duchess of Dankar, who had not wept when Sir Halbert Vane struck her across the face before all of society, put her face into her husband's hands, and wept at last not the tears of the ballroom, which she had refused him, but the tears of 5 years. The whole long-damned grief of half a decade of being unseen and unheld and uncared for, and the Duke of Dankar gathered his wife into his arms and let her weep it all out against his shoulder, and did not once tell her to stop, and understood that this, and not the ballroom, and not the revenge, and not the whole watching world was the true marriage, the real one, the private one, the one that no one would ever see, and that was worth more than every title he owned. By the next morning London had turned entirely over, the way London does, and the Duke of Dankar watched it turn with a cold satisfaction he did not trouble to hide. The cards began arriving before noon, a flood of them, from every great house that had spent the previous evening whispering about the nobody in the corner, all now falling over themselves to call, to congratulate, to have always known, my dear, that there was something distinguished about Miss Kembley. One saw it at once. The hypocrisy of it was breathtaking, and Berengaria, reading the cards aloud over breakfast with a mark still faintly visible on her cheek, found in it a bitter amusement that the Duke was glad to see, for bitter amusement was a great deal healthier than the composure of the ballroom, which had frightened him with its completeness. Lady Sefton, she read, who cut me directly at the Ashworths 3 years ago when I was introduced as a poor relation, and who I am quite sure does not remember doing it, writes that she has long admired my quiet dignity and hopes I will honour her at home on Thursday. Lady Sefton's memory is a marvel of convenience, and here is Mrs. Corve, who once returned a fan I had mended for her without a word of thanks, because one does not thank a servant, begging the favour of my acquaintance. And here, oh, this is very fine, here is a most affectionate note from Mrs. Ashworth herself, my dear cousin, expressing her joy at my happy elevation and her certainty that I will not forget the family that sheltered me in my difficulties, the family that sheltered me. Joris, I fetched that woman's shawls for 5 years, and she called me an expense to my face not 1 month ago. What would you like to do about the Ashworths? The Duke asked. He asked it quietly, watching her. You have only to tell me. There is a great deal I can do if you wish it done. Old Ashworth's affairs are not so sound as he pretends. I hold paper of his that I bought last year to relieve his tenants, and if you wished it, I could make his position very uncomfortable indeed. I do not press you to it. I only want you to know the power is there, and that it is yours to direct, and that I will not lift a finger toward them, one way or the other, without your word. Berengaria set down the cards and thought about it, seriously, in the way she thought about everything, and the Duke watched her think and loved her for the sight of it. I do not want to ruin them, she said at last. I have thought about it, God knows I have thought about it, a great many nights over a great many shawls, and I find, now that I could, that I do not want to. Ruining the Ashworths would only make me into a smaller version of Halbert Vane, a person who uses power to punish. And there is something else. If I ruin them, I punish Cassandra along with them, for she must live in that house, and a ruined house is a bitter place for a neglected child. No, here is what I want, and it is the only thing I want from the Ashworths in the whole world. She looked up. I want Cassandra. I want us to go there today, this week, as soon as it can be arranged, and I want to take that child out of that house and into ours, and I want to do it in such a way that the Ashworths cannot refuse, and are, in fact, glad to be rid of her. So that Cassandra never knows she was fought over and can believe, cleanly, that she was chosen. That is my revenge on the Ashworths, Joris, not to destroy them. To take the one thing in their house they never valued, and to love it, and to raise it into everything they were too small to see it could become. Let them keep their house and their name and their mortgages. I will take the child they threw away, the way Halbert Vane threw me away, and I will make of her a happiness they will read about for the rest of their lives and never understand. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. They went to Ashworth Park within the week. The Duke and Duchess of Danicar in the great crested carriage, and it was, the Duke would say afterward, one of the purest pleasures of his life. Not for any cruelty they did the Ashworths, for they did none, but for the exquisite spectacle of the Ashworths' scramble. Mrs. Ashworth, who had worked her poor relation like a servant for 5 years, received her now with a nauseating deference. "Oh, my dear Duchess," and such an honour, and we always knew, and the Duke watched Berengaria endure it with a serene courtesy that gave the woman nothing to feed on. Neither reproach nor warmth, only the smooth, impenetrable manner of a great lady who has entirely forgotten that she was ever anything else, which was, the Duke understood, its own kind of justice, and a far more lasting one than rage. And then Berengaria asked for Cassandra. She asked for the girl privately, first. Before she made any proposal to the parents, she would not have Cassandra learn her fate, as a transaction between adults, and the Duke waited in the drawing-room, while his wife went up to the schoolroom, where the neglected child was kept. And when Berengaria came down again, she was leading by the hand a plain, thin, frightened girl of 15, whose face, the Duke saw, had been transformed by something he recognized, because he had seen it once on Berengaria's own face in a cold garden, the look of a person who has just been told, by someone they trust, that they are wanted. "Cassandra," said Berengaria, "this is my husband, the Duke of Danicar, of whom I have told you. Joris, this is Cassandra, who is the bravest girl I know, and who has agreed to come and live with us at Danicar and be our own, if her mamma and papa will permit it," which her voice took on the faintest edge, aimed not at the child but over her head at the listening parents, which I am quite certain they will, for they are so very attentive to Cassandra's happiness. And they will see at once what an opportunity it is for her, and how much she is loved and wanted in a new home, which is the only thing, after all, that any of us has ever wanted for dear Cassandra. The Ashworths permitted it. Of course they permitted it. They were, if anything, relieved, though they concealed the relief under a great show of maternal sacrifice. And the Duke of Danicar, watching Cassandra Ashworth's frightened face turn slowly, over the course of that visit, from disbelief to hope to a fragile dawning joy, understood that his wife had just performed the truest act of revenge he had ever witnessed, and that it did not look like revenge at all, because it was made entirely of love, which was, he was coming to learn, the way Berengaria did everything, and the reason he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve her. Cassandra came to Danicar in the early summer, and the great empty house that the Duke had kept for years like a beautiful mausoleum began, for the second time in a 12-month, to fill with life. The child was, at first, almost unbearably grateful, and it was the gratitude that broke the Duke's heart, for it was the gratitude of a creature so unused to kindness that she flinched from it, waiting always for the catch, the withdrawal, the moment when she would be told it had all been a mistake and she must go back. She thanked the servants for everything. She apologized for taking up space. She ate too little at first, as though afraid to be seen to want anything, and she kept to her room unless summoned, and she watched Berengaria with a fierce, hungry devotion, and watched the Duke with plain terror, for she had never in her life known a great man to be anything but cold. The Duke of Danicar set himself to unteaching her the terror, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was good at it. He did it the way he had done everything since Berengaria came into his life, patiently, without pressing, meeting the person where they were rather than where he wished them to be. He discovered that Cassandra, like Berengaria, had a slower mind than her cousins, less brilliant, but genuine and curious and starved, a mind that had been told its whole life that it was stupid because no one had ever troubled to feed it. And so the Duke of Danecar, who had 38 years of the finest education in England and a library that was famous throughout the kingdom, began quietly to teach a plain, frightened girl of 15 the things no one had ever thought her worth teaching. He started with the stars, because they were beautiful and required nothing of her but wonder, and he took her out on clear nights to the observatory his grandfather had built and showed her the planets through the great telescope, and he watched the terror go out of her face, night by night. And something else come into it, the thing he had seen come into Berengaria's face in the garden, the opening of a person who is discovering, late and against all expectation, that they are worth something after all. "You are courting that child," Berengaria said to him one night, watching from the observatory door as the Duke and Cassandra bent together over a chart of the heavens, "exactly the way you courted me, with her mind. You found the one thing no one had ever valued in her, and you valued it, and you are watching her come alive under it. I did not know when I married you that you had it in you to be a father. I do not think you knew it either." "I did not," the Duke admitted. "I had assumed, if I thought of it at all, that I would be like my own father, correct and distant and disappointed. I find instead that he stopped, watching the girl's absorbed face in the lamplight. "I find that I would burn down London for that child, Berengaria. I have known her 2 months. She apologizes for existing and eats too little and flinches when I raise my voice, and I find that the flinching makes me want to weep, and the small victories, the night she laughed, the morning she asked for a second helping without apologizing, the day she contradicted me about the orbit of Mars and was right and knew she was right and did not take it back, make me happier than any triumph of my whole life before you. Is this what it is, to care for a child? I had no idea. No one told me. I have spent 38 years, and I had no idea that this was in the world to be had." "It is what it is," said Berengaria softly, and she came and stood beside him in the doorway, and they watched the girl they had rescued bend over the stars, and neither of them said anything more for a long while, because there was nothing more that needed saying. Cassandra blossomed at Danecar the way a plant blossoms that has been kept in the dark, and is finally set in the sun slowly at first, and then all at once, and into a shape no one who had known her in the dark would have predicted. The flinching left her. The apologizing left her. She grew over that first year into a girl of quiet confidence and real learning. Most surprising of all, a dry quick wit that came out once she felt safe enough to risk it, and that could make even the Duke of Danecar laugh aloud at his own dinner table. She was never brilliant like Berengaria. She never pretended to be, but she became something in some ways rarer, which was entirely herself, unafraid. A young woman who knew she was loved and knew she was worth teaching and carried both pieces of knowledge like armor into a world that had spent 15 years trying to convince her she was worthless. And she loved them, the Duke and Berengaria, both with the whole fierce loyalty of a child who has been chosen, which is a loyalty that nothing in this world can shake, because it is founded on the deepest gratitude the human heart can hold, the gratitude of the abandoned who has been taken in. She took the name Danecar in time, when they made her legally their ward, and then, at her own tearful asking, as near a daughter as the law would allow, and the county, which had first received the news of the Duke's strange marriage and stranger household with raised eyebrows, came in time to regard the whole thing with a grudging awe, for there was no denying that the once cold Duke of Danecar had made, out of an invisible companion and a discarded child, the warmest and happiest house in 3 counties, and that whatever alchemy he had worked, the rest of them would have given a great deal to learn it. "You know what they say of us now," Berengaria told him, one evening near the end of that first full year, with Cassandra's Lotta drifting in from the next room where the girl was reading something aloud to her old maid. "They say the Duke of Danecar was bewitched, that no man of sound mind marries a nobody and adopts a nobody's cast-off cousin, and so you must have been enchanted, and I must be a witch. And it is the only explanation that lets them keep believing that the world runs the way they have always believed it runs, that worth follows birth, and that a great man who steps outside that order must be out of his senses. Let them say it, said the Duke of Danecar, drawing his wife against him and listening to the child's laughter in the next room, the sound filling his great house, the sound he had not known he was starving for. Let them say I was bewitched. It is nearer the truth than they know. I was bewitched by a translation of Lucretius at 2 in the morning, and by a woman who beat me at philosophy and did not care that I was a duke, and by a frightened child who apologized for existing until we taught her not to. If that is witchcraft, then I am glad to be bewitched, and I hope the spell is never broken, and I will spend the rest of my life under it, and count every day of the enchantment the finest of my life. In the second season of their marriage, the Duke of Danecar gave a ball. He had not given a ball in 15 years. Danecar House in London had famously stood half shut, its great rooms shrouded, its owner a byword for cold reclusiveness. And so when the cards went out for a ball at Danecar House, in honor of the Duchess, all of society understood that something unprecedented was occurring, and there was not a soul among the invited who would have missed it for the world, and not a soul among the uninvited who did not feel the omission as a wound. The Duke had drawn the list himself, with Berengaria, and the drawing of it had been its own quiet act of justice, for there were names left off it that had spent years cutting Berengaria Kemberley, and there were names on it that no one expected the plain unfashionable scholars and thinkers whose company the Duke and Duchess actually valued, invited to stand among the beau monde as equals, which scandalized the beau monde nearly as much as the marriage had. Berengaria came down the great staircase of Danecar House on the night of the ball on her husband's arm, and the Duke, watching the assembled room watch her, thought that he had never in his life seen anything to equal it. She was not made beautiful by the occasion. That was the thing the Duke understood, watching. She wore the Danecar diamonds, and a gown that had cost a small fortune, and her hair was dressed by an artist, and she was, in the plain accounting of features, exactly what she had always been, a small brown-haired woman of no particular loveliness, the kind of woman a ballroom looks through. But no one looked through her now. Every eye in the great room followed her down the stair, and what they were watching was not beauty. It was authority. It was a woman who had spent 5 years being nobody and had been struck across the face by a nobody's contempt not 18 months before. Standing now at the head of the finest staircase in London as its mistress, entirely composed, entirely herself, wearing her new consequence not as a costume but as a plain fact, the way she had once worn her invisibility, and the room, which had come half to gawp and half to sneer, found itself, against its will, awed. The Duke presented her to them. He did it deliberately, formally, name by name, and there was in the formality a message that every guest received. This is the Duchess of Danecar. You will treat her as such, and those of you who once did otherwise will find that I have a long memory and a longer reach. And Berengaria received them one after another, the Lady Seftons and the Mrs. Corves, the whole gilded procession of people who had cut her and now bowed to her with a courtesy so perfect and so impenetrable that it left them nothing, no reproach to resent and no warmth to exploit. Only the smooth, immovable graciousness of a woman who had risen entirely above them and would never, by so much as a flicker, let them see that she remembered a single one of their cruelties. It was, the Duke thought, magnificent. It was the revenge of a queen, not to strike, but simply to be so wholly, unanswerably above the reach of the people who had wronged her that their wronging became, retroactively, absurd. The spectacle of ants who had once bitten a woman now discovered to be a mountain. There was one moment the Duke would remember above all the others. Late in the evening, a woman approached the Duchess, whom the Duke did not at first recognize, a faded, anxious woman in an unfashionable gown, hovering at the edge of the great room as though uncertain of her welcome, and he saw Berengaria's composed face change, soften, come alive, and he saw his wife cross the room herself to meet the woman, abandoning the great personages she had been receiving, and take both the faded woman's hands in her own with a warmth she had shown to no duchess that night. It was, he learned, the wife of a scholar, a poor, learned, unworldly man whose work Berengaria had admired for years, whom the Duke had invited at her particular request, and who had come, terrified, out of his depth, sure he did not belong. And Berengaria had seen the wife hovering at the edge, recognized in her at once the invisible woman she had herself so lately been, and left the whole glittering procession of her former tormentors standing to go and make one frightened nobody feel wanted. The Duke watched her do it, and he watched the faded woman's face transform under his wife's warmth, and he understood that this, and not the diamonds or the staircase or the triumph over the beau monde was the true meaning of the whole evening, that Berengaria, given at last all the power in the room, spent it not on the mighty who had wronged her, but on the lowly who reminded her of herself. She had not forgotten the corner. She would never forget the corner. She had simply crossed the whole width of the great room in the hour of her greatest triumph, to stand beside someone else who was in it. You left 3 countesses standing, the Duke murmured to her later, to go and comfort a scholar's frightened wife. Do you know that Lady Jersey was mid-sentence? Lady Jersey, said Berengaria serenely, has been received in every drawing-room in England her whole life and will survive being left mid-sentence for once. Mrs. Halliwell has been received in none of them, and was standing at the edge of the finest room in London, certain she did not belong, exactly as I once stood at the edge of the Ashworth's ballroom, and I could no more walk past her than I could walk past a drowning person. You gave me all this power tonight, Joris the staircase, the diamonds, the whole room bowing. What is the good of it if I spend it only on the people who already have everything? I would rather spend it on the ones in the corner. I know the corner. I lived in it 5 years. And I made myself a promise in the corner that if I ever got out of it, I would spend the rest of my life reaching back in. Tonight was the first payment on that promise. There will be a great many more. I hope you did not marry me expecting a duchess who would spend her consequence on being grand. I married you, said the Duke of Danecar, expecting nothing, because I had never met anyone remotely like you and had no template to expect anything by. And you have exceeded, every single day, the nothing I knew to hope for. Spend your consequence on the corner, my love. Spend all of it. It is the only use of power I have ever seen that did not slightly sicken me, and I find I would follow you into every corner in England, and I intend to. We shall be the strangest Duke and Duchess in the kingdom, the ones who fill their ballroom with scholars and leave the countesses standing. Let it be our legend. I can think of none I would rather have. As for Sir Hulbert Vane, the world dealt with him exactly as Berengaria had foretold, and the Duke of Danecar never had to lift a finger. The cut direct given by a duke before 200 witnesses, together with the truth spoken aloud in that same terrible, quiet voice, the truth of what Vane had done 5 years before, jilting a ruined girl and blackening her name to cover his own fickleness, finished Sir Hulbert Vane in London as thoroughly as a fire finishes a house. Doors that had stood open to him for years closed in a single week. The heiress with the squint and the £40,000 whom he had thrown Berengaria over to secure had died some years since without producing an heir, and her fortune had gone back to her own family, so that Vane was left with his ruined name and his diminished means and nothing else, and men who'd once courted his company now found reasons to be elsewhere, and the story of the ball, which grew in the telling as such stories do, followed him wherever he went, so that he became, in the space of a season, one of those men whom society has decided to forget, and who spend the remainder of their lives in a kind of living death, present at the edges of the world that once welcomed them, unseen, unspoken to, learning at last, too late, exactly what it feels like to be the nobody in the corner. The Duke of Danecar, when he heard reports of Vane's decline, felt a satisfaction he did not trouble to examine too closely. But Berengaria, when the reports reached her, felt something the Duke had not expected, and it taught him one last thing about the woman he had married. They saw Vane once more, some 3 years after the ball, by chance, at a watering place where the Duke had taken his wife for her health. He was much altered, thinner, shabbier, his fine looks gone to seed, his manner grown furtive and ingratiating in the way of a man who lives by the sufferance of others and knows it. He did not see them at first. And when he did, the Duke watched the man go pale and watched him half turn to flee, and watched him understand that flight was impossible, that he was trapped in a narrow walk with the very people who had destroyed him, and must pass them or make a scene. The Duke of Danecar felt his old fury stir, and he prepared to give the man, once again, the cut direct to look through him as though he were made of glass, the fitting punishment. But Berengaria's hand tightened on his arm, and she said very low, "No, Joris, let me," and she stopped. She stopped, and she made Vane stop, and she looked at the ruined man for a long moment with an expression the Duke could not read, and then she said, quietly without heat, "Good morning, Sir Halbert. You are not looking well. I am sorry for it." Vane stared at her. He had braced plainly for triumph, for gloating, for the cut. He had not braced for this, and it undid him more completely than any cruelty could have. "You," he managed. "You are sorry for it. You of all people. After what you cannot possibly be sorry for it." "I am not sorry for the justice of it," Berengaria said. "You earned every particle of what has happened to you, and I will not insult us both by pretending otherwise, and I do not forgive you. Forgiveness is a large word, and I do not think I owe it to you, and I will not counterfeit it. But I find, looking at you, that I am sorry all the same, not for you exactly, for the waste of it. You had once everything I lacked: birth and means and standing, and a young woman who loved you, and you threw the last of those away for money, and blackened her to salve your conscience. And now the money is gone and the standing is gone, and you are alone, and you did it all to yourself, one small cruelty at a time, and there is no one in the world to comfort you in it, because you spent your whole life making sure there would not be. That is a terrible thing to have made of a life. I lived 5 years in the corner you have now fallen into, and I would not wish it on my worst enemy, and it turns out, Sir Halbert, that even you are not quite my worst enemy anymore, because I have been too happy too long to keep the hatred alive. So I am sorry, not for your sake, for the sad, wasteful pity of it. Good morning. I do not think we shall meet again." And she walked on her husband's arm and did not look back, and left Sir Halbert Vane standing alone in the narrow walk with the ruins of his life, and the unbearable knowledge that the woman he had destroyed had grown so far beyond him that she could afford to pity him, which was, the Duke understood, the single most annihilating thing she could have done. And she had done it without one word of cruelty, out of a heart that had simply grown too large and too happy to hold him any more. "You astonish me," the Duke said. "When they were past, I was prepared to cut him. I wanted to cut him. And you pitied him instead, and it was 10 times crueler than any cut, and you did not mean it to be cruel at all. That is the terrible part. You meant it. You were actually sorry." "I was actually sorry," Berengaria said. "That is the thing you gave me, Joris, though you never meant to give me this particular gift. You made me so happy, so completely, that Halbert Vane simply shrank. He used to be enormous in my life. For 5 years he was the great wound at the center of everything, the thing I turned over every night, the revenge I perfected and could never take. And then you loved me, and we took Cassandra, and we filled the house with life, and somewhere in all of it, without my noticing the moment it happened, Halbert Vane got small. He got small and far away, and finally, standing in that walk, I saw him plain, not the monster of my 5 years, just a sad ruined man who wasted his life, and there was nothing left in me to hate him with, because you had filled the whole space the hatred used to live in with something better. That is the truest revenge, in the end, not to destroy them, to become so happy that they cannot reach you anymore, that they shrink to their true size, that you can look at the person who ruined your life and feel nothing sharper than pity. He cannot touch me. He never can again. And it is not because I defeated him, it is because I no longer need to. You gave me that. It is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, and you did not even know you were giving it. You only loved me. It turns out that was enough to make even Halbert Vane small. Their own children came in time, a son, and then 2 daughters, and the Duke of Dankar, who had once believed himself constitutionally incapable of warmth, discovered that he had been merely waiting, all those cold years, for the people who would draw it out of him. He was, the county agreed, an absurd father, absurd by the standards of his rank and his generation present, doting, endlessly interested, to be found on the nursery floor and in the schoolroom and out on the moor with a child on his shoulders. A duke who knew his own children's characters as intimately as their nurse did, and cared more. He taught them the stars as he had taught Cassandra, and he taught them to argue as Berengaria had taught him, and he taught them above all, and by plain daily example, the one lesson that mattered most in that house, that a person's worth had nothing whatever to do with their birth or their fortune or their beauty, and everything to do with their mind and their courage and their kindness. And that the measure of a great soul was not how it treated the mighty, but how it treated the overlooked. His children grew up unable to be cruel to a servant, incapable of looking through a poor relation, constitutionally on the side of whoever in any room was in the corner, for they had been raised by a mother who had lived in the corner and a father who had learned, late and completely, to reach into it, and the lesson had gone all the way down into what they were. Cassandra grew up too, and grew lovely not in feature, for she remained plain, but in the way that Berengaria was lovely, which is the loveliness of a person entirely at home in themselves. She was courted when her time came, and courted well, for the ward of the Duke of Danecar was a considerable prize, and the Duke and Berengaria watched with some anxiety the procession of young men who came, for they knew too well the varieties of suitor and feared for the plain girl they loved. But they need not have feared. Berengaria had raised Cassandra to know her own worth, and the Duke had raised her to value a mind, and Cassandra applied to her suitors exactly the measures her guardians had taught her, and turned away, one after another, the handsome and the well-connected and the merely ardent, until at last there came a young man, a younger son of no great fortune, a serious, awkward, brilliant young man who was studying the law and who talked to Cassandra as though her opinions were the most interesting thing in the room, because to him they were. He has no money to speak of, the Duke observed to Berengaria, watching the pair of them argue happily over a book in the window seat, exactly as he and Berengaria had once argued in a cold garden, and no title and no prospects but what he makes himself. Her mother would have hysterics. Her mother, said Berengaria, spent 15 years teaching that child she was worthless, and would now, I have no doubt, given the chance, sell her to the highest bidder without a thought for her happiness. We are not her mother. We are the people who taught her that the only marriage worth making is the one where a man values your mind, and she has gone and found exactly that. And if we now turn around and tell her that a valued mind is very well, but a fortune is better, we will have unraveled the whole of what we spent 6 years teaching her. She smiled, watching the young couple. He looks at her the way you looked at me over Lucretius. That is worth more than every fortune in England. Let her have him, Joris. Give them enough to live on and let her have him. She has earned the right to marry for the only reason worth marrying, which she learned in this house from us. It would be a betrayal of everything we are to deny it to her now. They gave Cassandra to her awkward, brilliant young lawyer, with a settlement generous enough to free them from want, but not so large as to make him feel bought. And the marriage was, by every account of the years that followed, one of the happiest in England. Two serious, loving minds, each convinced it had married above itself, raising their own children in the same faith they had both been raised in, that worth is not born but shown. And Cassandra, on her wedding day, took Berengaria aside and said the thing that Berengaria would carry in her heart for the rest of her life. You know what you did, Cassandra said. You do know, don't you? You came into that house when I was a little girl no one wanted, and you were the only person who ever told me I was worth anything, and then when everything changed for you, when you might have vanished into a duchess's life and forgotten the plain, neglected child in the schoolroom, you did not forget me. You came back for me. You took me out. You gave me a whole life, a real life, and a father who taught me the stars, and now a husband who thinks my mind is the finest thing in England, and every particle of it, every single particle, came from you not forgetting me. Do you understand what that means to a child who believed that no one stays? You stayed. You are the reason I know that people can stay. And I am going to spend the whole of my life staying for my own children, and for anyone I ever find in the corner, because you taught me how, and it is the only thing I know that is worth teaching, and I learned it from you. Berengaria wept, and the Duke of Danecar, coming upon the two of them weeping in each other's arms on Cassandra's wedding day, understood that his wife's promise in the corner that, if she ever got out of it, she would spend the rest of her life reaching back in had borne fruit that would outlast them all, for they had raised, out of one discarded child, a woman who would reach into the corner for the next discarded child, who would in turn reach in for the next, on and on, a chain of staying stretching down the generations, all of it beginning with an invisible companion who had refused to leave a neglected girl behind, and a cold duke who had learned from her how to let people in. The years at Danecar settled into a shape that the duke had never dared imagine for himself, and that he prized above every honor his rank had ever brought him, the shape of an ordinary, happy, deeply peopled life. He and Berengaria never stopped arguing philosophy. That was the secret heart of the marriage, the thing the county never saw and would not have understood if it had, that the Duke and Duchess of Danecar, married 20 years, still sat up late in the great library with a single lamp between them, taking opposite sides of some question of natural philosophy or history or the management of men, and arguing it out with a fierce, delighted rigor that neither of them had ever found in any other person alive. She still beat him often. He still learned from her, always. They had come together over a mind meeting a mind, and the meeting had never grown stale, because a mind, unlike a face, does not fade. It deepens, and the Duke of Danecar, who had chosen his wife for the one quality that improves rather than decays with age, found that he was more in love with her at 50 than he had been at 38, and more still at 60, because there was always more of her to discover, and she was always ahead of him, and the pursuit was the joy. They spent their power, both of them, in the way Berengaria had spent it at the great ball on the Corners. It became the known character of the House of Danecar, half admired and half mocked by the great world. That the Duke and Duchess filled their table with scholars and reformers and unfashionable, clever people. That the Duchess funded the education of poor girls with good minds quietly, by the dozen, all over the county, so that there grew up in that part of England a whole generation of women who had been given, because of her, the thing she had nearly been denied. That the Duke used his vast affluence in ways that puzzled his peers, relieving squeezed tenants, breaking the power of petty tyrants like old Ashworth, standing in the Lords for measures that would cost his own class money and gain him nothing but the county's love. They were, the Beaumont decided, eccentric to the point of folly. They did not care. They had each of them lived long enough on the wrong side of power to know exactly what it was worth and exactly what it was for, and they spent it accordingly and slept well and were happy. There was one custom Berengaria kept all her life, that the Duke loved above all the others. Every year on the anniversary of the ball where Sir Halbert Vane had struck her across the face and the Duke had crossed the room, she went, not to any grand celebration, but quietly, alone or with the Duke, to visit some woman in a corner. It might be a companion in a great house, ground down by unkind employers. It might be a governess or a poor relation or a plain neglected girl in a schoolroom whom no one valued. Berengaria sought them out, wherever she heard of them, and she went to them, and she did for them, in whatever way was possible, the thing that had been done for her. She saw them. She told them they were worth something. She opened, where she could, a door. She called it, privately, keeping the anniversary, and she never once, in all the years, let it pass unkept. You could hold a ball of your own, the Duke said to her once, on such an anniversary, watching her prepare to go out to some obscure charitable errand in a plain gown while all of London was dancing. You could make the anniversary a triumph. You have earned a triumph 100 times over. I held my triumph once, Berengaria said, at the great ball, the second one at Danecar House, when the whole room bowed and I came down the staircase in the diamonds. It was a fine thing, and I am glad I had it, and I do not need another. A triumph is a thing you have once to close a wound, and my wound is closed, and to keep holding triumphs after the wound has healed is only vanity, and I have no use for it. But the corner is never closed, Joris. There is always another woman in it. There will be a woman in the corner long after you and I are dust, and so the anniversary I keep is not the triumph, but the promise I made in the Ashworth's ballroom, that if I ever got out I would reach back in. The triumph was for me. The promise is for them. And it is the promise, not the triumph, that I want to have kept at the end. When I look back over the whole of it, anyone can be lifted up and enjoy the lifting. It is a smaller thing than people think. The larger thing, the only thing I have ever found worth doing with a fortunate life, is to remember the corner after you have left it, and to go back, and to reach in again and again for as long as you have breath. That is what I want said of me. Not that I married a duke. Not that I came down a staircase in diamonds. That I never forgot the corner. That is the whole of what I want. It is the only monument I care to leave. The Duke of Danecar looked at his wife, not young now, the brown hair gone grey, the plain face lined. The same steel and the same grace in it that had stopped him in a library at 2 in the morning half a lifetime before, and he thought that he had spent 38 years being called the most feared man in England and had feared himself. Only one thing in all that time, which was the vulnerability of loving anyone, and that he had been given, past all deserving, a woman who had made him unafraid of it, who had filled his cold house with children and scholars, and a rescued girl grown into a staying woman, who spent her consequence on the corners of the world and asked for no monument but a kept promise. And he understood that whatever the world said of the Duke of Danecar, and the world said a great many things, most of them wrong, the truest thing that could be said of him was simply this: that he had once in a ballroom crossed a crowded room toward a woman being struck, and that crossing that room had been the beginning of his whole real life, and that he would cross at it again and again and 1,000 times again, and count every crossing the finest act of a fortunate and unlooked for life. There was one keeping of the anniversary that the Duke of Danecar remembered above all the others, because it showed him, more clearly than any words, exactly what he had married. It was perhaps the 10th year. Berengaria had heard she had a network by then, of former poor scholars' wives and rescued governesses and grateful schoolmistresses, who wrote to her from all over the county whenever they learned of a woman in trouble of a companion in a great house 40 miles off. A young woman named Alice Perrot, gently born and orphaned and penniless, who was being ground down in exactly the way Berengaria herself had once been ground down, worked like a servant and reminded daily of her dependence, and had, the report said, begun to despair in the particular way that frightened Berengaria most, because she knew it from the inside. The quiet giving up, the shrinking, the slow acceptance of one's own worthlessness, that is the true and final damage such houses do. "We are going," Berengaria said to the Duke, "today. Both of us. I know it is 40 miles, and I know we are expected at the Hendersons, and I do not care. There is a girl despairing in a corner, and I know exactly what her despair feels like, and I will not sit at the Hendersons' dinner while she gives up. Send our excuses. We are going to Marbeck Hall." They went to Marbeck Hall, the Duke and Duchess of Danecar, unannounced, in the great crested carriage, and their arrival threw the household of Marbeck into the predictable frenzy, for a duke does not descend on a country family without warning, and the master and mistress of the house came scrambling out full of flustered honor, and Berengaria was perfectly, glacially gracious to them. And then she said, in the tone of a great lady making the most natural request in the world, "I understand you have a Miss Perrot in your household, a companion. I find I have a particular wish to speak with her, privately. Now, if you please." The consternation this caused was, the Duke thought, worth the 40 miles by itself. The master and mistress of Marbeck could not imagine what the Duchess of Danecar could want with their drudge of a companion. They were plainly terrified that the girl had somehow given offence, or made some appeal above her station. They stammered and delayed, and Berengaria simply waited, immovable, until they produced the girl. Alice Perrot came into the room like a creature expecting a blow. The Duke knew the walk. He had seen it in Cassandra all those years before, the walk of a person who has learned that being summoned means being found fault with. She was perhaps 20, thin, plainly dressed, her eyes down, her whole bearing folded in on itself, and Berengaria looked at her, and the Duke watched his wife's face, and he saw on it not pity, which would have been useless, but recognition, the plain, fierce recognition of one's survivor for another. "Miss Perrot," Berengaria said, "look at me, please. I am not going to reproach you. Look at me." The girl looked up, frightened. "I want to tell you something," Berengaria said, "and I want you to hear it, because I know I promise you that I know, better than you can imagine, exactly what your life is in this house, and exactly what it is doing to you. 5 years I lived as you are living now, a poor relation, a companion. Worked like a servant, reminded daily that I was an expense, made to feel that my existence was a burden I ought to apologize for. I know the despair you're in, the quiet kind, the giving up kind, the kind where you begin to believe that they are right, that you are worth nothing, that this is all you will ever be. I know it because I felt it. And I am here to tell you, in person, having crossed 40 miles to do it, the one thing that no one told me, and that I nearly died for want of hearing. They are wrong. Do you understand me?" They are wrong about you. Your worth has nothing to do with your fortune or your usefulness to them or their opinion of you. You are not an expense. You are not a burden. You are a person of value who has fallen, through no fault of your own, into the power of small people who cannot see it, and their blindness is not the truth about you, it is only the truth about them. The girl had begun silently to weep. I am going to take you out of here, Berengaria said gently and absolutely, today, if you will come. There is a place for you at Dankar, not as a servant, not as a poor relation, but as a person, to be educated if you wish it, or trained to a profession, or simply given time and safety to remember who you are. My husband and I make it our particular business to reach into corners like the one you are in, because I lived in one, and I made a promise that if I ever got out I would spend my life reaching back in. This is me keeping the promise. You do not have to decide this instant. But I want you to know the door is open, and it will stay open, and you are not trapped here forever, no matter what they have taught you to believe. Will you come? Alice Perrot looked at the Duchess of Dankar, this great lady in her diamonds who had crossed 40 miles to tell a despairing drudge that she was worth something, and the Duke watched the girl's ruined face perform the same slow miracle he had watched Cassandra's perform a decade before. Disbelief giving way to hope, giving way to a fragile dawning, transforming joy, the joy of a person who has just been told by someone with the power to make it true that they are wanted. I'll come, the girl whispered. I'll come. Only why? You don't know me. Why would you cross 40 miles for me? I'm nobody. And Berengaria, Duchess of Dankar, took the weeping girl's hands in her own and said the thing that the Duke would carry in his heart for the rest of his life, the thing that was the whole of his wife distilled into a single sentence. Because I was nobody once too, and somebody crossed a room for me. My husband crossed a crowded ballroom, before all of society, toward a woman being struck, and it began the whole of my real life. I have been crossing rooms ever since for other women, because he taught me that it is the only thing power is truly for. Today the room was 40 miles long. It does not matter. You cross it anyway. You always cross it. There is always someone in the corner, and you were once in it yourself, and so you go, and you reach in, and you bring them out. That is the whole secret, Miss Perrot. That is everything I know. Now dry your eyes, and pack your things, and come and be somebody, because you always were, and it is high time someone told you so. They brought Alice Perrot home to Dankar that night, and she flourished there as Cassandra had flourished, and grew into a schoolmistress herself in time, and founded a school for poor girls in a corner of the county, and reached, all her life, into corners, and the Duke of Dankar, riding home in the dark with his wife, and the rescued girl asleep across from them, understood that he was watching the promise multiply, one crossed room at a time, spreading out from a single ballroom into a web of rescue that would outlast them all, and that had all begun with a man who once stopped in a doorway, and looked and did not pass by. They grew old at Dankar, in the great house that had once stood half-shrouded and silent and was now, and had been for decades, the warmest and most peopled house in 3 counties. The children married and had children of their own, and brought them back to Dankar in the summers, so that the house rang with 3 generations, and Cassandra came, always, with her lawyer husband grown eminent now, and their brood of serious loving children, and the scholars still came, and the poor clever girls whose education Berengaria had funded came, grown into schoolmistresses and writers and physicians' wives, to pay their respects to the woman who had opened the door for them, and the Duke of Dankar sat at the head of a table that his younger self would not have recognized, surrounded by a life he had built out of nothing but the courage, learned late to let people in, and he counted himself, plainly and without irony, the most fortunate man in England. He told Berengaria so on an evening near the end, when they were both very old and sat together in the great library where they had argued philosophy for 50 years, a single lamp burning between them as it always had. I have been thinking, he said, about the man I was before you. The Duke of Dankar, the most feared man in England, who held the whole business of marriage in contempt and believed himself constitutionally incapable of loving anyone, and who was, when you strip away the title and the fortune and the fearsome reputation, simply the loneliest creature in the kingdom, a man who had made his whole life into a fortress with nothing inside it, and called the emptiness dignity. That man was 38 years old, Berengaria, and he believed his life was essentially over, that he had become what he would be, cold and alone and untouchable, and that there was nothing left to happen to him but the slow accumulation of more years exactly like the ones behind. And then he read a translation of Lucretius at 2 in the morning. He took her hand, the old hand he had held for half a century, and raised it to his lips. Everything came from that. You, the children, Cassandra and her staying, the scholars, the girls, the whole warm, crowded life of this house. 50 years of the deepest happiness a man was ever given. All of it came from a sheet of paper tucked into a book, and a woman asleep in a chair, and a lonely man in a doorway who, for once in his cold life, stopped and looked instead of passing by. I nearly passed by. Do you know that? I nearly withdrew. I told myself it was not my business. A companion asleep in a library, and I very nearly turned and went back to my empty room and my empty life, and if I had, his voice roughened, if I had, I would have died the man I was, and never known you, and never known any of this, and gone to my grave believing that fortress was all a life could be. I stopped in a doorway. That is the whole of it. Twice in my life I stopped in a doorway and looked at you instead of passing by, once in that library, and once in that ballroom, and both times the looking remade the whole of my existence. A man's life turns on such small things. A doorway, a paused step, the choice to look. You did not nearly pass by, Berengaria said gently. I have never believed that, though you have told me the story 100 times. You are not a man who passes by, Joris. You only spent 38 years pretending to be, because pretending was safer. The proof is that you did stop both times, and a man who truly passes by does stop even once. The fortress was never you. It was only the wall you built around you, and I did not put anything into you that first night in the library that was not already there waiting. I only found the door. That is all any of us can do for each other. In the end, find the door and knock and wait to be let in. You let me in. That was your doing, not mine. The bravest thing you ever did was not crossing the ballroom. That was easy. That was anger. Any man in love can cross a ballroom in anger. The bravest thing you ever did was in the library, when there was no anger and no crisis and nothing forcing your hand, only a lonely man and a sleeping stranger and the terrifying possibility of caring some about someone, and you put a log on the fire so I would not be cold. And you did not take my translation, and you went away and could not stop thinking of me. That was the brave thing. That was the whole of it. Everything else followed from a man who was frightened of caring, choosing, quietly, in an empty library at 2 in the morning, to care anyway. I have loved you for 50 years, Joris of Daincar, and I have loved a great many things about you, but that the log on the fire, the caring you were so frightened of, and anyway that is the thing I have loved best, and it is the thing I will love last. When there is only time to love one thing, they sat a long while in the lamplight, the old Duke and the old Duchess, hand in hand, and the great warm house breathed around them, full of the sleeping life they had made, 3 generations of it, and the fire burned low. And neither of them moved to ring for more logs, content in the deepening dark with the single lamp and each other. Read me the Lucretius, the Duke said at last, softly, the passage you were translating that first night. I have it by heart now after 50 years, but I would hear you read it once more. It is where we began. I should like it to be near us at the end. And Berengaria, Duchess of Daincar, who had come out of a corner that the whole world had left her to die in, took up the old worn book from the table beside her, and found the passage, and read it aloud to her husband in the lamplight in her low, clear voice, exactly as she had first written it out. A poor invisible companion translating for no reason but her own pleasure at 2 in the morning half a century before, and the Duke of Daincar closed his eyes and listened to the voice that had remade his whole life, and thought that a man could ask nothing more of his time on earth than this: to have stopped once in a doorway, to have looked instead of passing by, to have let one person in, and to be here at the far warm end of it all, still listening to that person's voice in the library where it all began. With the whole of a good and crowded and unlooked-for life sleeping happily under the roof they had filled together, he had crossed the room, all those years ago, toward a woman being struck. He understood now that he had never really stopped crossing it. He had spent his whole life crossing that room toward her every day, and would be crossing it still at the very last. And there was no finer thing a life could be spent on, and he knew it, and he was glad.